Hey guys, this is Dr. Hathcock, and I told you I'd put together a little review video for exam 4. So in preparing for the exam, again, it's online. It's going to be 20 multiple choice, 10 fill in the blank. Then you write an essay. It's like every test you've taken so far. Anyway, some of the things to look at. This test is going to deal with Texas in the 1920s, Texas through the Great Depression and the New Deal, and then Texas in World War II. But I guess the first thing on our list here is economic growth in Texas in the 1920s. Mainly, I'm looking at oil. Even though oil had been discovered before the 1920s in Texas, still in the 1920s, it's when it really took off as an industry. You had oil in the sort of the East Texas area, the West Texas area. You started to have a lot of refineries and things like that popping up here in Texas, oil pipelines. So really a big part of Texas's growth in the 1920s was about oil and the rise of the oil industry. The impact of the 18th Amendment in Texas is mainly its prohibition. It's illegal to have alcohol. And, people all across the United States were violating the prohibition laws. So its impact in Texas is it made people feel like there was a lot of lawlessness, that there was a lot of crime. You combine that with a lot of people moving to the state for jobs in the oil industry, and there was a feeling that there were a lot of criminal elements that were involved in that as well. So yeah, the impact of the 18th Amendment in Texas is it made people feel like things were out of control and there was a lot of lawlessness in the state. In the 1920s, I talked about how there was a lot of change for women, for African Americans. People started dressing a little differently. I guess you could say moral norms were being relaxed. And conservative Texans just did not embrace any of that stuff. They stuck to the old tried and true values. But you put all that together, the feeling of lawlessness, the feeling that the world is changing, it's really what led to the KKK rising in our state of Texas. The political impact that the Klan had, they got people elected to local office here in the state. They even got a U.S. senator elected. So yeah, the KKK really came to dominate this state. A lot of Texans joined up to be members of the thing, and it did have quite a significant political impact on the state as well. Okay, Mom, Pa Ferguson. What I'm really looking for there more than anything is, Pa Ferguson had been the governor of the state previously, but he was found guilty of corruption, extortion, things like that. So the Supreme Court of Texas had ruled that he could never hold office in the state again. So he had his wife run instead. And Ma Ferguson really was sort of just like a figurehead, a puppet. Behind the scenes, Pa Ferguson really was running things. The next point would be able to explain bank runs. This is where people got afraid that their bank was going to collapse, that their money was going to be lost. So rather than keep their money in the bank, people just started to line up and take their money out of the bank. This was just fear. It was paranoia that caused these bank runs. The main point is when everyone would line up to take their money out of a bank, that bank would collapse, it would go bankrupt, and that would just further damage the economy. Okay, unemployment in Texas during the Great Depression. Texas really fit in with the national levels. It was at 30% at the height of the Great Depression. So Texas and the entire country was about 30% unemployment. Let's see, anger towards President Hoover. Yeah, Texans at first, they weren't too upset at Hoover when he began his administration, but, as the Depression got worse, there really was a feeling that he wasn't doing anything to help the situation, that the country really needed some type of relief, some type of help, and Hoover he wasn't supplying that. Failures of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Like I said in class, the money was being sent to businesses and banks. It wasn't going directly to the unemployed people who needed the relief the most. Governor Ross Sterling's response to the Great Depression is it's a lot like Herbert Hoover's. He really didn't do much. He tried to control overproduction of oil, overproduction of cotton as well. He kept state expenditures to a minimum, but no like direct relief to the people who needed it the most. Okay, so the first New Deal and its programs, you'll remember the first New Deal was about trying to restore the institutions, the banks, the stock market, and things like that. So yeah, I'm going to ask you to go back and look at programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, all that stuff that's listed there in your notes and in your outline. Then the second New Deal and its programs was about trying to help people live their everyday lives. The second New Deal, some of its bigger programs were things like the National Youth Administration, Social Security. So yeah, you're going to need to go back and know all those programs as well. Let's see. So then we had that moment where conservative Texas politicians, they turned on FDR because of his court packing scheme. That idea that he had of trying to stack the court with 6 new justices, that of course he would get to pick all 6 of those judges. But it was Texas politicians in particular that really stood up to him and kept that from passing in the Congress. Early U.S. efforts to help the Allies during World War I. On that slide, I talked about things like the Selective Service Act, the Destroyers for Bases deal, the Lend-Lease Act. So yeah, just go back and look at all those things. Patrolling the North Atlantic. So yeah, go back and look at how early on the United States was trying to help the Allied effort during World War I. Then we talked a lot, during World War II. Got my world wars mixed up there. Okay, so now Texas heroes of World War II. We spent a little bit of time talking about Admiral Nimitz, Macario Garcia, Dory Miller, all those guys. So go back and sort of look at them, maybe, I don't know, where they came from, their service, what it was they did during the war that led to them receiving medals and accommodations. Let's see, we also had the 3 R's of the New Deal. Go back and look in your notes, your outline, for what those 3 R's were, specifically what the New Deal was trying to do. Then last but not least, we have these possible essay topics. Explain Texas in the 1920s by looking at prohibition, perceived lawlessness, rise of the KKK. And I just explained that in going through those points up above. Why did the KKK become a powerful organization in Texas during the 20s? Because people felt like there was lawlessness, that everything was falling apart, the society was changing. So here came the Klan, claiming to be a very pro-American, patriotic organization that would fight for morality, that would fight against lawlessness. Then explain how Ma and Pa Ferguson won the governorship in 1924, who was really in charge. So Ma and Pa Ferguson were sort of like the anti-KKK option in 1924. Instead of voting for the Klan or Klan politicians, you could vote for Ma and Pa Ferguson, who were, well, Pa anyway was very corrupt, but who was really in charge was Pa Ferguson. Okay, the next possible essay, explain how commercial banks in part contributed to the economic collapse of the United States after the stock market crash of October 1929. So banks throughout the 1920s were using people's banking and checking accounts to make loans. That's what they do always. But they were making loans for stock purchase. So when the market was going up, everyone was okay. They were paying off their loans. They were quite happy to do so. But then when the market crashed, people stopped making payments on their loans. The stock itself started to become worthless. So when people stopped making their payments, the banks were more or less given the stock, collateral on the loans. And that's a situation where the banks had lent money for people to buy things that were now worth a lot less than what they'd been lent for. So the banks were saddled with bad debt, bad money. They start to hemorrhage money. That causes some banks to collapse. Then those bank failures led to other banks collapsing because of fear and paranoia. The bank runs, if you will, people taking out their money. What impact did banks have on the high rising prices of stocks in the late 20s? Well, when middle class people took out loans to buy stocks, Brokers on Wall Street saw them as suckers, as naive, someone who they could take advantage of. So, yeah, they started inflating those prices to take advantage of those people. So, how did the oil industry at first help Texas survive the onset of the Depression, later make the situation worse? So, yeah, at first, there were jobs to be had in the oil industry. Early on in the Depression, it looked like Texas might survive. But then the oil industry, in its greed, just started pumping out too much oil. They caused the supply to skyrocket, which then caused the price of oil to just drastically drop. So that too causes a bit of a problem in the oil industry in Texas there in the 20s. Okay, your last possible essay, explain the rise of fascism in both Europe and Asia in the 1930s. So in lecture, I talked about how Nazi Germany was about two primary things. It was about the promise of jobs, the promise of economic recovery, as well as anti-Semitism, or the scapegoating and hatred of Jews. So that's sort of the path that Hitler took to power. Then in Asia, it was this idea that the Japanese were a superior race of people. They believed that Asia needed to be controlled by Asians. So they set out to conquer Asia, I guess for its own good, if you will, that they would then be in control of Asia, and they would cleanse Asia of any and all Western influence, British, French, American, things like that. Why did the U.S. ultimately enter World War II? Explain the event. It's Pearl Harbor. The attack on December the 7th, 1941 is what led the United States into World War II. How did Texas contribute to the Allied war effort? Let's see. So in Texas, we had home front productivity. Our state became a massive training base for soldiers who were going to be sent off to fight in the war. We also trained pilots. Pilots trained here anyway, on how to fly aircraft that they would be using during World War II. Texas also was a place where POWs were kept. Specifically, German prisoners of war would be held here in the state of Texas as well. And how did World War II change Texas by 1945? So I said that going into the war, Texas was a primarily rural agricultural state. But then after the war was over with, Texas becomes much more of an urban or big city state with more industry and commerce. All right. Well, again, I hope you guys enjoyed your semester. Good luck on this exam 4, and take care. Bye.